Hello everyone and welcome back to another Napoleonic Wars reaction. We're trying to finish this series. I'm going all out on completing this one. It's a very long series indeed. Anyways, today we are watching Wellington's triumph, the Battle of Vitoria 1813. While the Allied armies had seized the initiative and were on the march, the French armies were scattered all over Spain. Marshal Jourdan, Chief of Staff to King Joseph of Spain. Indeed, Wellington had by 1813 concentrated his Anglo-Spanish, Portuguese armies, and he was poised to strike. And meanwhile, the French were scattered all over the place, trying to defend, trying to hold on to their occupied regions. And they couldn't concentrate because if they did, all of those occupied regions would fall into the hands of the guerrillas. The same problematic situation that has existed for 6 years at this point during the entire Peninsular War.
May 1813. While Napoleon's Grande Armée began its fight back in Central Europe following the disastrous invasion of Russia, 1,200 miles away, at the other end of Napoleon's embattled empire, another enemy was poised to strike. The previous year, Wellington's Anglo-Portuguese army had won a brilliant victory at Salamanca, but been held at Burgos and forced into a long, demoralizing retreat back to the Portuguese frontier. But after a winter of rest, reinforcement and training, Wellington's army was stronger than ever. 100,000 men, many of them battle-hardened veterans. And for the first time, he had sufficient cavalry and artillery, while transport and medical services had also been improved. Morale was sky high. Their chief, known to the troops as Old Nosey, was cheered wherever he went.
Not the most flattering nickname.
"I never saw the British army so healthy or so strong," Wellington informed London. In contrast, the French position in Spain was weaker than ever. Napoleon severely underestimated the threat posed by Wellington and had just withdrawn 20,000 French troops for his own use in Germany.
And this is, unfortunately for Napoleon, he does this all the time when it comes to Wellington. Back in 1812, he had informed Joseph that Wellington would not dare to go on the offensive in 1812. Well, he did. He beat Marmont badly at Salamanca and almost, retook central Spain. And again, in 1813, Napoleon once again underestimates Wellington's as a general. He still thinks the English are bad troops, and he thinks that Wellington is a overly cautious general, like Marmont. But despite all of these warnings that Wellington was not the man Napoleon thought he was, he continues to withdraw more troops. He withdrew troops for his Russian campaign. Now he needs those Spanish veterans in his German campaigns. He desperately needs them. I mean, he would have to do that move one way or another to shore up his huge numerical disadvantage in Germany. But yeah, that means the French situation in Spain is more precarious than ever before.
As commander-in-chief, King Joseph knew his forces were overstretched. Napoleon allowed him to give up Madrid and move his capital to the more easily defended Valladolid. But withdrawing further to a strong position like the Ebro River was out of the question.
And here we see again, Joseph and Marshal Jourdan are the ones on the ground. They are in Spain. They can see the situation is untenable for the French, but it's still Napoleon who is calling the shot with his long-range interventions from wherever he is, whether he's in Paris or whether he's in Leipzig or whether he's at Moscow. Napoleon continues to direct the war from afar, and he doesn't have an understanding of how dire the situation really is. And Joseph and Jourdan were right in that withdrawing behind the Ebro River would have been a prudent move that would have allowed the French to, at least, if nothing else, hold back Wellington from invading France itself. But alas, it was not to be.
That would send the wrong message to neutral Austria and Napoleon's wavering German allies.
I do understand this consideration by Napoleon, because he wants to keep up appearances, as it was, that the situation in Spain is not great, but, it's under control, and Wellington does not pose a significant threat to Joseph's Spanish kingdom. And nothing could be further from the truth, of course, but he is incorrect in assessing that this would be a huge sign of weakness to the neutral countries, especially Austria, of course, who commanded the most troops out of all the countries that still remained out of this conflict, which was not many. So, yeah.
And so, with serious concerns, Joseph and his chief of staff, Marshal Jourdan, awaited Wellington's offensive. This video is sponsored by Raid, Shadow Legends, Kingdom, World Champions, and the satisfying historical tactics on other players. Use the link below to download Raid for PC or mobile now. Thank you to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video.
In a few days we shall take the field. The campaign bids fair to be most brilliant. I hope to see the Pyrenees before September. Lieutenant George Simmons.
Wellington's plan was for his army to advance in two wings, concentrate at Toro, then move against Joseph's forces. In the south, Murray's Anglo-Sicilian Spanish force, based in Alicante, had just repelled an attack by Marshal Suchet at the Battle of Castalla. Murray would now mount a diversionary landing on the Mediterranean coast to coincide with Wellington's advance and prevent Suchet sending reinforcements north. Wellington had also counted on large-scale support from Spanish regular forces, of which he was, since November 1812, theoretically commander-in-chief. But the Spanish Cortes, based in Cadiz, was deeply divided, with many still highly suspicious of British motives. The result was that Wellington would only receive direct support from a few reliable Spanish divisions.
Yes, and even at this late stage, the Spanish are very, very suspicious of British motives in Spain. And such, even though he has been made commander-in-chief of Spanish forces, he will only receive some support. Because if he was truly the commander-in-chief, he would be able to direct all of Spain's forces and call upon all the Spanish reinforcements he needed. But that was not the case. Still, this was a great step forward in Anglo-Spanish relations, to entrust at least some Spanish troops to British command, because they realized that their own commanders were incompetent. And yeah, the Spanish divisions, with the help of some British training and British leadership, would prove themselves to be moderately competent forces.
Fortunately, he would receive considerable Spanish support from the guerrillas.
That he would.
Now better armed, organized, and operating in greater numbers than ever before. A large area of Valencia had effectively been liberated by El Fraile, the Friar. Esposimina had captured major towns in Navarre and was currently keeping General Clausel's Army of the North busy, while Juan Martín Díaz, aka El Empecinado, was tying down large numbers of French troops near Madrid.
Farewell, Portugal. I shall never see you again. The Marquis of Wellington. And he never did.
On the 22nd of May, Wellington bid farewell to Portugal and began his advance. 4 days later, he was in Salamanca, from where he joined the northern wing of his army under Sir Thomas Graham.
So the French thought they could do the same as they did in 1812 and hold the Burgos road, and that would prevent any French or any British advance further into central Spain, because the terrain to the north was quite inhospitable to armies, especially armies with cannons, no less. And so they dismissed the possibility of Wellington trying to outflank them, except pretty much every French general did, though Marshal Jourdan was pretty much the only one who recognized that this might be a possibility. But unfortunately, Jourdan's authority over the other French generals was quite weak. And that had been the case for a long time, even though technically, as the chief military advisor to King Joseph, they should have followed his orders. So yeah, Jourdan had some insight into what was actually going on.
Joseph and Jourdan expected Wellington's main thrust to come from Salamanca, so planned to defend the line of the Douro River. But Graham's rapid advance north of the river meant they'd already been outflanked, and they ordered a retreat. By a series of brilliant marches, Wellington continued threatening the French right flank, forcing Joseph to keep falling back. Wellington's army was able to use small roads and mountain tracks north of the main highway, which the French had dismissed as impassable. But thanks to his Spanish allies, Wellington knew better.
Yeah. Thanks to the help of Spanish informers and guerrillas, Wellington had accurate knowledge about the local terrain and was able to use that to outflank with his army through these narrow mountain passages. And it was not by any means an easy feat. This would not have been possible during the early days of the British intervention in Spain. But by 1813, the logistical operations and supply situation for Wellington's armies are quite good, and they are able to pull this off. A very impressive feat, no matter how you look at it.
Backed by British sea power, he was also now able to switch his supply base from Lisbon to Santander, drastically reducing the length of his supply lines, another feat the French had written off as impossible.
Yes, and again, this is due to terrain that the French thought it was impossible to do this sort of move. But this cuts, 300 miles on the supply lines from Lisbon to Burgos, and it's quite important at this stage in the campaign that Wellington finds another base of logistical operations, because he's about to invade France itself, and he's not going to get logistical support from the French. So yeah, this was a good and prudent move by the British.
At the Ebro River, the French found themselves outflanked yet again and fell back to Vitoria. Here, Joseph decided that he must make his stand.
Yes, and they only decided that quite rapidly. It was a decision taken in all haste, because at this point, Joseph needed to evacuate all the treasuries, all the documents and other stuff that they had looted from the Spanish back to France, and needed some place to hold off the British so they could get all of these stuff away. And Vitoria was chosen as a very ideal defensive position, actually. But unfortunately, we will see the French hampered by poor military leadership.
The Zadorra River valley west of Vitoria seemed to offer a strong defensive position. Expecting an attack from the west, French forces were drawn up in 3 lines. General Gazon's Army of the South formed the first line. Then General d'Erlon's Army of the Centre. Then General Rey's Army of Portugal. Joseph hoped that he could at least buy time for the vast wagon convoy assembled east of the city to get away. It contained not only military supplies, but his government's treasury. And as satirized by this contemporary British cartoon, the accumulated loot of 5 years' French occupation of Spain, including priceless works of art, jewels and antiques. He also expected General Clausel to arrive with 20,000 reinforcements any day.
This was crucial in the calculations of Jourdan and Joseph, was that Clausel was relatively close by, and if he could reinforce their positions, they would probably be able to hold Wellington off. Unfortunately, Clausel was busy fighting the guerrillas, and
However, thanks to the guerrillas, Wellington was better informed of Clausel's whereabouts than Joseph himself. Knowing that Clausel couldn't reach Joseph before the 22nd of June, he decided to attack on the 21st. The day before, French patrols reported enemy troop movement to the north, so Rey's troops were moved to cover any threat to the army's line of communications.
And this was mostly a concern by Marshal Jourdan. Again, he thought that Wellington's main thrust might actually come from the north, and he made sure to send troops over there to defend the lines of communication so they don't get cut off from France.
Apart from one division, which left to escort part of the wagon convoy to France. An odd decision that deprived the army of 4,000 men on the eve of battle.
Now, I understand the need for an escort for this wagon convoy. It contains a lot of treasuries, as I said before. But when you're already outnumbered, and they knew they were outnumbered, this is a really odd decision. 4,000 men is nothing to sneeze at. That's 4 regiments, and almost an entire division worth of troop just put out of action this way. It's a strange move, really.
Marshal Jourdan had been bedridden with fever that day. The next morning, he reconnoitred the army's position with King Joseph. They agreed that their position was overextended and should be shortened. But by the time their orders reached General Gazon, it was too late. He was already under attack.
Yes, the day before, Jourdan was ill with fever, and he was plagued by illness throughout his military career. And this is very unfortunate because they did recognize that their lines were overextended and they had to do something about that. But by the time they had done that reconnaissance, it was too late to act. A sharp firing on the right gave us notice that the ball had been opened. Second Lieutenant Georges Lestrange.
Wellington, enjoying the advantage in numbers for once, had decided to attack in 4 columns across a 10-mile front, with General Graham's left-hand column threatening Joseph's line of retreat. It was a bold plan, with the potential to trap and destroy Joseph's army, but required careful coordination and precise timing.
And Jourdan, as the battle develops, will think that the main thrust is indeed coming from the north, and that the attack from the west, or whatever it is, was a diversion. But as it turns out, none of these attacks were feints. They were all full-on head-on attacks.
Fortunately, the French had not thought it necessary to destroy any of the bridges over the Zadorra River, which was also fordable in several places.
That's only partially true. It is in the French troops or officers who reconnoitered the positions did say that the river was shallow and easily fordable. And that was only a partially accurate assessment, which led them to not to destroy these bridges. In fact, in many places, the riverbanks were quite steep and high in many places, which made access pretty difficult. And in several places, the river was actually dammed for the use of several mills, which created pretty wide and deep lagoons. And so the river was not as easily fordable as it might have looked at on a quick scouting mission. And if they realized all of that I just mentioned, they probably would have destroyed the bridges. And they should have done it anyhow, you know? Because then they would have to spend time creating pontoon bridges, and at the very least it would slow down Wellington's advance just a little bit at least. And when they were crossing the rivers, they could hit them with everything they got and force them back across in disarray. That's just my take on the whole situation here.
At 8 a.m., General Hill's column began its attack on the Allied right. Spanish and British troops advanced up the western heights of Puebla, driving off French skirmishers and forcing General Gazan to send reinforcements to secure his left flank. Hill's troops then seized the village of Subiana, but French cannon fire and counterattacks prevented any further advance. Convinced that Hill's attack was the main assault, and that troop movements to the north were probably a diversion, Jourdan continued to send troops from the center to reinforce the left.
By now he realized he thought he realized the truth, but he didn't.
What Wellington wanted. But at 11 a.m., he was waiting with growing impatience for his other columns to go into action. Lord Dalhousie's 7th Division, supposed to be leading the attack by the center-left column, had got held up in the mountains. While further east, Graham's flanking move had got off to a cautious start. But seeing the size of the approaching force, General Ray decided to pull back his troops across the Zadorra River.
Good move.
This encouraged Graham to get things moving. Colonel Longa's Spanish division advanced on Durana, held by Spanish troops loyal to King Joseph.
Spanish troops loyal to King Joseph. Now that's a rarity, but I believe these were actually the Spanish Royal Guards, perhaps? I might be wrong on that. But I think it was King Joseph's personal Spanish bodyguard unit that occupied Durana. And they sent Longa's Spanish division to attack that position. And so basically we got a civil war almost going on, which must have been... well, it must have produced some feelings of anxiousness among the troops on both sides.
Bitter struggle for the village ensued. British and Portuguese infantry advanced against Camara Mayor. They were soon engaged in bloody street fighting with the French. This scene shows an attack by the 4th King's Own Regiment of Foot and the 47th Lancashire Regiment. Though they succeeded in driving the French out of the village, they could not cross its bridge over the Zadorra, which was expertly covered by French guns.
Come on, ye rascals! Come on, ye fighting villains! General Sir Thomas Picton, British 3rd Division. Ah yes, Picton. And if you've ever seen the movie Waterloo, you would know of General Picton. He is the one who's wearing the top hat all the time, and his blue top coat. A very notorious, very recognizable figure, and one of those colorful characters of the Napoleonic Wars.
Around noon, a Spanish peasant informed Wellington that the bridge at Tres Puentes was completely unguarded. He immediately ordered Kempt's elite light infantry brigade to dash across it and secure a bridgehead. But there was still little sign of Dalhousie's 7th Division. General Picton, the notoriously short-tempered commander of the fighting 3rd Division, ran out of patience. Fed up with waiting for Dalhousie, he ordered his men to advance. They charged across the Mendoza Bridge and a nearby ford, driving back light French defences. General Gazan, with his left flank pinned down at Subiana, was now about to be outflanked on his right, and had no option but to pull back his troops. Wellington's army was now crossing the Zadorra River in force.
This is what I mean. They would not have been able to cross in force like this if they had destroyed the bridges. It's really quite unfortunate decision-making by Jourdan and Joseph.
Fighting continued to rage on the heights of Puebla, but here the French also had to give ground to maintain the cohesion of their new line. Scottish Highlanders and Connaught Rangers, supported by riflemen and Portuguese troops, now stormed the village of Arigneth, routing the defenders, who retreated southeast, and a gap began to emerge in the French centre between Gazan's army of the south and d'Erlon's army of the centre. The Allied advance continued, with heavy pressure on both French flanks. Wellington's army appeared to be building unstoppable momentum, with Graham's column poised to cut off Joseph's escape.
Artillery and musketry were heard in one continuous, uninterrupted volume of sound. The fire had already become exceedingly violent.
By 4 p.m., Wellington's army was formed up across the Zadorra, ready to strike a decisive blow. But his infantry came under heavy fire from 76 French guns, blasting great holes in their ranks. Allied guns were brought forward to provide support. The biggest artillery duel of the Peninsular War began. More than 70 guns on each side.
Compared to the great clashes in Central Europe, 70 guns on each side is a pretty low number. But for the Peninsular War, this was certainly a very big artillery duel. The biggest, of course, like they just said. Because, sometimes most of the time, the Spanish were up against Spanish irregular forces. And so the use of artillery was not ideal fighting guerrilla war. And the amount of clashes, major clashes between Wellington's armies and the French are limited in number. And sometimes you were not able to deploy artillery due to the terrain and whatnot. So this terrain is very suitable for an artillery duel. Big open flat plains.
Allied skirmishers, exploiting the gap in the French centre near Gomecha, were able to work their way behind the French guns and shoot down their crews. Gazan found himself threatened on both flanks. But instead of trying to close up with d'Erlon to his north, on his own initiative he ordered a retreat that left d'Erlon's own left flank completely exposed. Around the same time, Longa's Spanish troops finally captured Durana, and rumours swept the French army that their escape route had been cut. D'Erlon's army of the centre fought on bravely, withdrawing to another new defensive line just 1 mile west of Vitoria. French guns kept up a steady fire on the advancing Allied lines, but once more the position was outflanked. Around 5:30 p.m, King Joseph bowed to the inevitable and ordered a general retreat.
$5 million were abandoned by the French and left upon the ground. Ensign George Bell, 34th Cumberland Regiment of...
As the main road to France had now been cut by Longa's Spanish troops, the army would have to retreat east towards Pamplona along a single narrow road with boggy fields on either side. Bad enough for thousands of troops and guns, but there had been no attempt to move off the army's enormous convoy of wagons earlier in the day. The result was pandemonium, as military units and artillery tried to force their way through the streets of Vitoria and the congested lanes and fields beyond. The task of forming a rearguard fell to General Reis' Army of Portugal, which conducted an organized withdrawal covered by its cavalry. Wellington hoped that Graham's column would now be surging across the Zadorra River to cut off the French army's retreat. But Graham, overestimating the enemy's strength, continued to take a cautious approach.
Yeah, and this is very characteristic of the British performance at the Battle of Vitoria. There were many times where the units were not used as efficiently as they could have, and sometimes that resulted in higher casualties than need be. And Graham's decision not to use this moment to cut off the French basically allowed Joseph to retreat in relatively good order. It was still chaos, but it could have been even worse. And crucially, many more French prisoners would have been captured.
East of Vitoria, the French retreat descended into total chaos. The single narrow road became blocked. Wagons that took to the fields got stuck and were abandoned. Allied cavalry fell upon this confused mass, spreading panic and meeting little serious opposition.
So the wagon convoy was, according to some sources, about 3,000 wagons, and that's not counting the pack animals and all the other stuff that followed with it. So you could imagine the absolute pandemonium that resulted. This depiction is quite apt.
King Joseph and Marshal Jourdan themselves narrowly escaped capture. Among the abandoned wagons, many civilians, including officers, wives and children, priceless paintings, jewels and furniture, and more than 5 million gold francs. Troops on both sides broke ranks and dived into an orgy of plundering. One British officer described the scene. About dusk, the head of our column came suddenly on some wagons which had been abandoned by the enemy. Someone called out, "They are money carts!" No sooner were the words uttered than the division broke as if by word of command, and in an instant the covers disappeared from the wagons and nothing was seen but a mass of inverted legs, while the arms were groping for dollars. For money it certainly was.
You know, some things don't really change, and armies that loot on the march are one of those things, and unfortunately we can still see this sort of behavior even more despicable than this particular incident. But if we look at the situation in Ukraine, where Ukrainian shops and homes are being looted for all sorts of stuff, including basic appliances such as washing machines, if you can believe that. But anyways, I digress. The soldiers' pay in this era was pretty poor, and if you wanted to earn some real money while on campaign, you needed to loot, and this was the greatest opportunity you could ever imagine. A kingdom's treasury just lying on the field for anyone to take.
The scene was disgraceful, but at the same time, ludicrous.
I can imagine.
Wellington, however, was furious. Not only did the plundering delay pursuit of the enemy, but giant sums of cash, which might have paid for his army's supplies, vanished into private pockets instead. Of 5.5 million francs, only 250,000 were ever recovered by the army. Vitoria was a great victory for the coalition, not as crushing as it might have been, reflected in relatively light French casualties. But in the chaotic retreat that followed, the Allies did capture all but 2 of 153 French guns, and even Jourdan's marshal's bateau.
Yes, the greatest loss for the French was really in the amount of cannon. We've lost 151 guns. That's a lot of cannons that are not easily replaceable. And as I said, the French casualties, all things considered, are relatively light, really. The amount of wounded is similar, the amount of killed is also similar. The only major difference is that the British managed to capture more prisoners, or some more people went missing from the French army. And yeah, all in all, it was quite an even fight still. You have sent me among the trophies of your unrivaled fame, the baton of a French marshal, and I send you in return that of England. The British army will hail it with rapturous enthusiasm. The Prince Regent, the Field Marshal Lord Wellington. Yeah, after Vitoria, Wellington was promoted to Field Marshal of the British Army, and he was sent the Field Marshal's baton in return for sending Marshal Jourdan's baton to England, where it remains this day, actually, in the Duke of Wellington baton collection. And the Prince Regent, of course, is the future George IV, because George III is still alive at this point, but his condition is so terrible, mentally and physically, that he is no longer able to act as king. And so, by this point, the Parliament has transferred power to the Prince Regent. Just a side tangent there.
French military power in Iberia was broken. The Bonapartist Kingdom of Spain was at an end. Joseph returned to France to face his brother's criticism. Marshal Jourdan retired from active service. Napoleon sent Marshal Soult to replace them, but even his shrewd military mind could not turn the tide in Spain.
Not for lack of trying.
Counterattacks to relieve the French garrisons at Pamplona and San Sebastian were defeated. That autumn, Wellington began what proved an unstoppable advance across the Pyrenees and into France.
Actually, the Battle of Vitoria was one of the events that tipped the scales for Austria in terms of whether to side against Napoleon or not. And I also believe that Emperor Alexander and Emperor Francis actually offered the command of their respective armies to Lord Wellington, but apparently he declined. Not sure if that's true, I would need to source that more, but that's something I've read before. And it would not surprise me if that were the case, considering that Wellington is basically the only commander that had seen consistent French success during all of these years in the Peninsular War.
In southern Spain, where Marshal Suchet remained undefeated, the disaster at Vitoria forced him also to withdraw towards the frontier.
It's really quite unfortunate for Marshal Suchet. It feels like his talents were really wasted in Spain, and he would have been an absolutely key player for Napoleon in any of his other campaigns from 1809 onwards, basically. Suchet was, like I said, he was wasted. He was too good to be in Spain, really.
Leaving behind.
But maybe that's also why he needed to be there, because, the situation was so difficult.
Just a few isolated garrisons. After a bitter 5-year struggle, the Allies had brought the Peninsular War, to the Spanish their War of Independence, to a victorious conclusion. It had been a long, hard road, steeped in blood and suffering. The alliance between Britain and Spain had been particularly treacherous to navigate. But ultimately, both nations had fought together with Portugal to drive the French back across the Pyrenees. New research provides a clearer insight than ever into the huge attrition of French manpower in Iberia. An estimated total of 260,000 lives lost. 3/4 died of sickness.
Yeah, I know this was very common before the First World War. Really, World War II was the... Yeah, the First World War was the first war in human history, basically, that more people died of actual combat than sickness. And before that, the vast majorities of casualties were as a result of sickness. But 3/4? That's almost 200,000 men, as you can see, which is actually mind-boggling to me. That only about, 65,000 or so actually died, or, as a result of combat. So, yeah. But as I said, this is very common. It's not... The ratio is a bit lopsided, perhaps, but still.
Of approximately 66,000 deaths from combat, 43% were in actions against Spanish regular forces, 38% fighting British-led armies, and 19% fighting guerrillas. By contrast, British military deaths are estimated at 52,000, Portuguese 15,000, with many more thousands of civilian deaths, while Spanish deaths are unknown, though the country as a whole may have lost as many as 500,000 lives in 5 years of war and occupation.
Oh, yeah, I definitely believe it could be as high as 500,000. And the Portuguese lost a lot of civilians too in this conflict. And as always in any war, it's always the civilians who gets caught in the crossfire, and they always suffer the most from. So, yeah, it's an extremely brutal conflict. It really is like Vietnam, and the amount of French and British teenagers that died in this senseless war is staggering, really.
For Napoleon, this disaster had been an unnecessary and largely self-inflicted wound.
Yes, definitely.
An intervention born of arrogance and false assumptions.
Absolutely.
With dire strategic consequences.
The whole intervention in Spain was a misjudgment from Napoleon from the start. He thought they would welcome him as a liberator from the old corrupt regime, and he didn't really have an understanding. He tried to impose the reforms of the French Revolution on a deeply conservative Catholic country. And it just, like I said, it was an intervention born of arrogance and many, many false assumptions about how he would be received and how they would respond to French reforms and all that. So, yeah. And this picture here with Madrid and Moscow, it's quite apt. This is the two conflicts that brought Napoleon down. He lost too many men, almost 1 million men in the Russian campaign and the Spanish campaign. And those losses were just too much to bear, even for France.
But as the Napoleonic Empire crumbled in Spain, an even greater struggle neared its climax in Central Europe, where Napoleon faced the most powerful coalition of his enemies yet. If the French Emperor was victorious in Germany, Wellington might soon be scrambling back across the Pyrenees. The fate of Europe was about to be decided at the Battle of Leipzig.
Alright, that was the Battle of Vitoria, 1813. Next up we have Leipzig, the greatest battle of the Napoleonic Wars, the climax, really, of it all. And we'll take that on next time. But until then, if you have any comments, you want to leave some insights, please do. I always try to respond to any comments. And subscribe for more videos. And until next time, bye.